20.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 25 of Shanalytics. This is the quarter to 100 episode. And we'll get there. We'll get to 100 episodes eventually, but we're getting along the way. I got to introduce my guest, though. Jordan Elliott of Niners Nation, a.k.a. Splash Cousin on Twitter. Jordan, you've been at camp pretty much every single day, I believe, besides the first day of training camp. You've been doing some awesome reports, getting some good information for everybody. How you doing, man? I hope the grind isn't too much because I know there's been a lot going on lately.
I'm doing good, man. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, it's definitely taxing, but I'm not going to lie. I could definitely be worse off than spending the day out in the California sun watching some football. So it's been definitely more positive than negative, but there's definitely been some days where it's been a little taxing. So it was nice to get a day off yesterday, back for the next couple of days, and obviously the first preseason game on Saturday. So, we're starting to get in the swing of things. So it's been a really fun week.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jason Aponte was supposed to join us tonight, but he'll be joining us. He'll be joining me some other time. I'll definitely have him on again. So tonight it's just going to be me and you for everyone. I just want to make that clear. Before I get into everything, Jordan, and you know what? I didn't necessarily prep you on this, but I have to ask you. Your name is Splash Cousin on Twitter. How's your jump shot, man?
I actually went out and I shot around last week for the first time in like 2 months with Kyle Posey of Niners Nation and then with Jason Aponte while he was out here. I'm not trying to, get ahead of myself here, but let's just say, it's like riding a bike. You get back on and you just, it doesn't really ever leave you. Not much of a 3-point shooter, but that mid-range bucket never is going to leave. So when I stepped on the court, I got a little bit of a hard time from Jason. He was like, "Oh yeah, you haven't been on a court for a few months." He thought I was lying. I tried to tell him, like, dude, if you get decent shooting on the baseline and the mid-range, it doesn't really go away. So there, I'm really comfortable. You put me behind the 3-point line, I'm probably shooting like 25%, dude. But I like shooting around the elbow and the baseline. I'll always be comfortable shooting around there.
Oh, no, I definitely hear you on that, man. I see myself as a free throw line extended sort of guy, operating that mid-range game, especially. But I do want to get into a few things before we get into some of our topics. Today was day 11 of training camp, I believe. We got some information from Kyle Shanahan. We had, of course, the ongoing quarterback battle. For you, was there anything specifically beyond the quarterbacks that stood out to you? Anyone who maybe was better or worse today than they had been for the rest of the training camp?
So it's a player that's really good and is an all-pro level player, a superstar player. So I don't know how much, validity we want to put into me saying he looked great today. But George Kittle had a phenomenal practice today. And especially during 11-on-11s, he was targeted frequently. He was dominating over the middle when the guys were matched up with him in man coverage. He was winning consistently. And I don't think he was playing bad by any stretch, but he definitely wasn't getting targeted anywhere near as much. Like, he's caught more balls in the last 2 practices than he did in the previous 8 combined. So that's definitely encouraging to see because I think he's going to be the 49ers' number 1 receiving option, even with the ascension of Brandon Ayuk and I would say the new Deebo Samuel, but the Deebo Samuel that is in great shape that all the coaches and players can't stop raving about. So that was really good to see. Another guy, again, it's another guy who's a superstar level player, but I think just because of all the other stuff going on, he may not get the credit. Fred Warner continues just to look great day in and day out, and that's something that I'm sure 49ers fans will be happy to hear given the big extension that he got. But again, people aren't strangers to how talented he is. So I thought today was more so just a day that those superstar building block, core players that they're going to be building this franchise around for the next half decade or so really did show out and they kind of proved why they are worth the amount of money they're being given and the amount of equity that the 49ers are investing in them.
Yeah, and on the George Kittle topic specifically, I mean, I don't think it's just you. There are a number of reporters who are saying, while it's not like George Kittle wasn't doing George Kittle type things. It was that he wasn't getting the level of targets that we're used to seeing, especially earlier on in his 49ers career versus I think pretty much every day. I feel like just from what I was reading, it seems like Ayuk, Debo were getting 5 to 6 targets every single day, and you would see Kittle lower on that depth chart. And of course, Grant's guy Ross Dwelly was getting all the targets in the world. But it's great to hear that George Kittle's doing well, and Fred Warner too, especially because while he's not someone that people have noted a lot in camp, it is something important for the 49ers. And with the new defensive coordinator, with DeMeco Ryans, Fred Warner playing his best is of the utmost importance for this team. So that's really great to hear.
Yeah, it's another situation. Another guy I'd add in where we just get used to them being so good is Trent Williams. Trent Williams is just a joy to watch. And I understand there's a lot of people who probably could not care less about offensive line play. But for anybody who appreciates the intricacies of, trench warfare, watching this guy go to work and the rarity that he loses reps with, like this guy hardly ever gets beat. And when he does, it's like you kind of have to like do a double take and ask yourself, did I really just see that happen? So I think that's one thing. As deep as the 49ers roster is, they also have guys at, the quarterback position will sort itself out. I know we'll get into the Trey Lance stuff. He looks phenomenal as well. Very excited about him. I know that's Jesse's guy. I see Jesse in the comments. I know he's probably thrilled to hear all the good news coming out of camp about him. But I think that just the way they've built the roster with having a stud middle linebacker who's also really good in coverage and kind of transcends the traditional positional mold you'd have at that linebacking position in Warner, that tight end, but who's also an alpha receiving option in Kittle, who also does tremendous things in the run game, and then obviously having a left tackle and a guy to kind of anchor that offensive line. They've just done a really good job identifying guys that can be solid building blocks and foundational pieces and allocating that big money to players who really are going to be consistently elite year in and year out.
Yeah, and then in terms of that's some great stuff. But in terms of the kind of last question I have about camp before we dive into the topics I sent you, the one thing I don't think I've seen some information on, but I'm curious to hear your insight with the return game in specific, with the punt returns. Who have you seen take the majority of those punt returns? And then do you think anyone is starting to edge themselves out potentially as that number one punt returner on this team?
So Brandon Ayuk has been getting the first crack at punt returns, kick returns, any kind of like special teams return work. He's out there getting the first reps. I don't know if that means anything or if it has any like significance, but he's been out there consistently. I've thought that Simba Webster has looked really strong as well. Travis Benjamin is a veteran who has experience returning punts. Those would be the guys that I think kind of have the edge currently. Trent Sherfield is a guy I think they brought in with an idea of being a special teams guy who might compete for a depth spot, but he's been so good running routes as a receiver, displaying really clutch ability in key situations. He's been a guy that both quarterbacks have looked to on third down repeatedly during 11-on-11. He has good hands. He seems to be a reliable route runner where he's going to be in the spots that he's supposed to be. So I don't know that he's going to get the amount of run returning punts that we may have expected, just because I think he's going to be more in line for reps with the actual offense itself. So if I had to guess, if they were going to have a guy be just strictly a returner at this point who might also work on special teams, I think Simba Webster would be the front runner for that. But I think that what they're going to end up doing is they're going to have Ayuk, Sherfield, and maybe one other player who makes the roster. Maybe it's Ambry Thomas. He used to return punts in college. He's a guy who has pretty good speed. If he ends up making that roster, they might just find a way to have kind of like a timeshare there. But if it were going to, be one guy that they're going to have be like just their job is to return punts and then be a gunner or some kind of special teams role, I think Simba Webster would be my pick as of now.
And that's a great name and one I haven't really heard of late, but it's important because I think the thing right now with the wide receiver room is that if you look beyond Debo, Ayuk, there's all these receivers who are kind of in a mismatch, and it's so deep at that spot. But then you'll have certain guys like Travis Benjamin or River Craycraft who offer that special teams upside. So I think it's going to be an interesting decision to see how the 49ers cut they're on cut day in terms of the wide receivers they decide on keeping, who they decide on letting go of. So I'll be very interested in that. And especially with that return game aspect, with it being such an issue for the 49ers in the past few years. I mean, last year it was really just River Craycraft taking a lot of, balls behind his head, just taking fair catches. So I know it's something 49ers fans should be excited for. I'm hoping Brandon Ayuk can get a lot more run, but I think like you just said, right, it's not that there's going to be one guy in specific. It's more timeshare situational, especially with a guy like Ayuk, because you definitely don't want him getting injured in that kind of spot. But he is so explosive and he showed so much in college. It's kind of hard to completely ignore him in that role altogether.
Yeah, and he's definitely going to get some kind of looks. They wouldn't be having him work this much. And he stayed after practice on, I forget if it was Sunday or Friday, one of those days over the weekend. He stayed after practice for a considerable amount of time and was working on strictly just fielding punts. So I think he's a guy that definitely has kind of, a plan mapped out that he's on board with as well to get at least some, maybe it's a situational thing. Like let's say it's, 45 seconds before halftime or something like that. Putting a guy like Brandon Ayuk out there might get you an extra 10 or 15 yards, where instead of just going into the half, taking a couple knees, you're in a position where you can turn that into 3 points maybe. Like that extra field position makes all the difference in the world. I just don't think he's going to be a guy that you see out there returning every single punt. I think maybe he'll be used a little bit like Odell Beckham's been used in the past, where in high leverage situations, they put him back there because he has the reliable hands. He has that great vision, the patience. That's one thing that Ayuk is really good at as well. He's really good at having patience and letting his blocks develop in front of him. So I think that anybody who's seen his college tape, he was a great returner in college. I don't see any reason why that skill wouldn't translate to the next level. I just think it's a matter of how much do they want to use him. But I think ultimately, football, no matter what level you're playing at, whether it's the NFL or whether it's, Pop Warner High School, ultimately there's so many intricate things, scheme-wise, coverage-wise, all these different things you do, but it really comes down to just putting the football in your best player's hands as many times as possible. And Brandon Ayuk is clearly one of the best players on the 49ers, so I personally would not be opposed at all to letting him field a few punts a game, just because you're increasing your chances of having big plays and having better field position and all the things that go into winning football simply by having such a basic strategy of having the ball in one of your best player's hands more times than you would if he wasn't returning punts.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. I'm totally on board with you for that. I think it's like you said, a few times a game. I don't think he would get any more than 20, maybe 25 would be pushing it returns in the total season. But like you said, situational football, really, when they need that type of field tilting, field changing sort of thing. Brandon Ayuk is absolutely someone they could rely on for that sort of play. And I'm really excited, like you were just saying, he's getting that run. So the potential's there, like we've seen, and hopefully now he'll just get the opportunity. But I do want to dive into the topics I wanted to ask you about today. Like I said, you've been at training camp every single day except for the first day. For you, and we're starting off a little negative here, but I haven't really heard about any super underwhelming players from camp so far, at least maybe not any player in specific, but for you, for what you've been looking for, is there any player that's underwhelmed the most to you?
Yeah, and it's early, so I want to, put the caveat out there that it is early because there's two players who come to mind, and they're both rookies, and that would be Aaron Banks, who was a second-round pick, the guard out of Notre Dame, and then Ambry Thomas, the third-round pick, the corner out of Michigan. Thomas and Banks, I will say now, in the last couple practices, have both turned around significantly compared to where they were at a few days ago, a week ago, whatever. But the beginning of camp, both had a rough start. Banks, I'm sure, the plan was to have Brunskill continue to start at right guard, but I'm sure if Banks showed enough, they would have some way of working him into getting first-team reps. They gave Colton McKivitz first-team reps. Banks hadn't played anywhere near the level of deserving those first-team reps, which is probably why he hasn't gotten any. He was getting beat repeatedly in one-on-one reps. He had a few bad reps during 11-on-11s as well. And I think it's a situation where they've invested, a good amount of capital into him, taking him that high. He's a top 50 pick. Again, we're not panicking yet. There's no reason to be, labeling him a bust or anything like that at this point. But I definitely think that I was expecting a bit more from him just based on the college tape I watched. And, admittedly, I didn't think the Niners were going to draft a guard of his size. So I think it speaks to kind of shift in philosophy. So I didn't watch too much stuff on him. I had them, more pegged to take a guy like Kendrick Green, who ultimately ended up going to the Steelers, guys like that it seemed to fit that lighter, more fleet of foot mold. So when I did watch Banks, I was very impressed with his tape, but I haven't seen that translate yet to his reps in training camp. But I will say the last couple of days, he's turned it around quite a bit. And it's kind of a similar thing with Thomas. where it seemed like every time there was a big play during 11-on-11s or these one-on-ones, he was the guy responsible in coverage. He was really good at press man in college, and it looked like he was getting beat off the line when he was pressing quite a bit. And again, it could just be an adjustment. As great as these guys are in college, there's a huge jump from playing at the collegiate level to the NFL. These are the best of the best. We know that. So it's encouraging to see them turn it around, but it certainly did underwhelm me right away. And there's nobody else I can think of off the top of my head that had that level of being underwhelming that those two did. But again, the encouraging thing is that the last couple of days, they've definitely taken a step forward. Today, there was a couple reps where Banks did get beat, but he responded really well after, and he did have a couple of really good reps as well. Whereas the first few days I was watching him, it just seemed like he was getting beat almost every time. And that Niners defensive line is great. Not just the first team, the second and third team is so deep. So it is going to be a little difficult, but at the same time, if you're a top 50 pick, you should be expected to come in and contribute. So they would definitely be my picks. But again, they are turning it around. So hopefully they'll continue to build on that momentum and carry that into this first preseason game this weekend.
Yeah, Banks is definitely one of the guys. Like, obviously, I'm not there. I'm not seeing everything in person, but from all the reports I've seen, it seems like he has sort of underwhelmed, especially like with what you were saying, being a top 50 pick at the guard position. Considering where the 49ers took him and the way the run on guards went, he, in terms of the tier he was in, they took him at the top of his tier in terms of guards. So there was certainly a lot of expectations out of him with that high of a draft capital invested into him. And then like you were saying, you mentioned Kendrick Green as a name. Part of the reason, or part of the issue kind of like I had with the 49ers draft strategy, is that you don't want to take a guard usually that early in the draft. I feel like later second, later third round is kind of that sweet spot where you can get really good value. And I kind of felt at the time not as much of it as if it was a reach or anything, but in terms of positional value, there were just other positions I think I would have rather had the 49ers target at that spot. And then with Ambry Thomas too, I think it's kind of goes for both of them really. It's the two toughest positions outside of quarterback to really adjust to in the NFL, especially in your rookie season, that guard, that corner position. So with Ambry Thomas, I know that's a position that a lot of 49ers fans have been worried about. In specific, they worry about the depth at that position. So I'm really interested to see how he does in that preseason game against the Chiefs on Saturday. I feel like that'll be a really good litmus test, especially considering how tough it is for rookie corners to adjust in training camp and all of that. So yeah, I hear you on those two names. And like you mentioned, it seems like all the other players on the 49ers roster are living up to what we expected from them. If not, they're right there. So I definitely hear you on those two names in specific. And I guess in this upcoming preseason game, what would you want to see out of Aaron Banks and Ambry Thomas to maybe give you a little more confidence in them?
Well, they're going to get beat. Like, it happens to even the best of NFL players, but I just want to see how they respond to that adversity. And I just want to see them continue to make strides where it looks like they're getting more comfortable playing at this level. For Thomas, more so understanding his assignments in zone coverage and being more comfortable with his eyes, in the backfield, sitting in zone coverage. Because I think that he's had reps where he's gotten beat, but he's more comfortable. I don't doubt that he has the ability to translate as a man corner with the more reps that he gets. And, I saw in the comments, it was a great point. He didn't play during 2020. He opted out due to COVID. So he has a good amount of rust to shake off, because no matter how much work you put in the offseason, nothing simulates actual real-time, gameplay like they're getting now. So I think that's something to watch with him. And then with Banks, it's just stringing consistent reps together, because he's had some good reps that really stand out, and then he's had some reps that look really bad. It hasn't really been there hasn't been much consistency there. So even if he's just playing at an average level where he's not blowing guys away and pancaking guys in the run game and really just, dominating his pass protection reps, as long as he's not getting beat and he's consistently being average, I think that's a great step in the right direction.
For sure. Yeah, no, those are some great points. And we've just been talking about offensive line a lot. That kind of leads me to the next thing I wanted to talk about with you. And I'm really curious, because you've obviously, like I said, you've been there for most of training camp. Oh, what have you seen from the starting offensive line from the 49ers in terms of the cohesiveness as a unit. I think, and over the offseason, they made the additions, Alex Mack, Aaron Banks, of course, like we just mentioned. And there was a hope really that they could get collectively better as a unit. Whereas you saw Trent Williams, of course, be the guy he was, but in 2020, that offensive line unit was just struggling so much, and there was so much inconsistency there.
So first off, I'll start out. The signing of Alex Mack was one that I was excited about because he's just a veteran. Admittedly, I'm a Cal Bear fan, so when they signed Alex Mack, I was excited strictly based off, a Cal alum joining the team. But I had thought, based on the Falcons games I've been privy to and the data that I have access to, that he hasn't had a significant drop off, but he's slowly regressed over and over and over again. And that regression kind of is on par with somebody who is, I believe he's 36 years old now. You have to expect that as these guys have been in the league for over a decade and they're getting older, the more wear and tear they get on their body, there is going to be a little bit of that natural decline that isn't necessarily like always a bad player. It's just, he's kind of getting up there in age. He looks phenomenal. He has had a couple practices where there was one day where I specifically tweeted out he was the best player on the field, and I honestly didn't think it was close. He was phenomenal. And the biggest thing with Alex Mack is solidifying that center position and dominating the reps he's dominating. He's not only taking on guys who are lined up directly across from him in zero technique or a nose tackle, he's also helping the guys to his right and left. So you're seeing when Laken Tomlinson and Brunskill or McKivitz, when he was in there with the ones, when these guys are getting beat or they need a little bit of help, when they're getting, they're starting to lose the rep that they're in, he's been there to clean up a lot of mistakes for other guys as well. And he's made both guard spots, whoever's been starting there, look significantly better just based on the consistency that he brings. So that was a much, much better signing than I expected it to be. I am very pleased with what I've seen so far. I also think that he's been giving Javon Kinlaw a little bit of, a lesson from a veteran. I think there's a lot of things that Kinlaw can pick up and learn. It's kind of that whole iron sharpening iron thing we heard about when Staley and Bosa were going at it during Bosa's rookie year during camp. So I'm seeing a similar kind of relationship take place between those two, where I think there's a lot to learn from Mack in that sense. And then the other thing I'd point out is I know, there's a lot being made about McGlinchey coming back at a bigger weight. He's hoping that he can be a little bit better. The thing is with McGlinchey is that, he gets beat to the outside. And that's one thing that hasn't really changed too much that I think he still needs to continue to work on is if there's a speed rusher with any kind of elite burst on the outside shoulder of his, he's got to have a great first step off the line, because if he gets beat, he's not great at recovering. And so we're seeing Dee Ford, Arden Key, Jordan Willis, some of these guys who do have that plus speed that are getting coached up by Chris Koserek and that D line that really, and Daryl Tapp, these guys that are teaching them to get upfield quickly. McGlinchey still is struggling a bit with that, but he's responding really well. Like I remember there was a day a few days ago where Dee Ford, went at him 3-4 times and really gave him the business on some pass rushing reps during 11-on-11. And, instead of just kind of crumbling and, keeping his head down and calling it a day, you could tell McGlinchey was getting kind of fired up, talking to himself a little bit. And then he responded with 2 really good reps against Ford when Ford tried to cut back inside, and then another where he tried to bull rush him. So if he can consistently get better at holding the edge and not letting that elite burst on the outside be his ultimate detriment, I think Mike McGlinchey looks much improved as well. And then, Trent Williams, I can't say enough great things about the guy. He is just a consummate professional, one of the best tackles of his generation. And, it's insane that the 49ers were able to go from over a decade of Joe Staley and then immediately transition over to Trent Williams, who, no disrespect to Joe Staley, he's a phenomenal player. I just think at this stages of their careers, because Joe Staley had a lot of injury, he was getting older. Trent Williams was an upgrade from the Joe Staley they had in 2019 and continues to be. And that's remarkable given how great Joe Staley was and the level of play he played at. So I think that the line as a whole is looking really good. It's just a matter, the only question I have is what ends up happening at that right guard spot, because I don't think you invest at some positions, you're okay investing that high draft capital in a player and allowing them to kind of develop and mature, and you're not rushing them. If you're spending a second-round pick on a guard, you'd almost hope that they'd be ready to beat out whoever the incumbent is. And Daniel Brunskill is a good player, but he's certainly not a player. It's not like they drafted a tackle who has to beat out Williams or McGlinchey. Brunskill is a guy that you should be able to beat out if you are that top 50 pick. So I'll be interested to see how that plays out in the long run. because I think ultimately getting some kind of consistency at right guard will do wonders for Mike McGlinchey as well. Because as much as he's had his own individual struggles, you do also have to add in the context that he's had a revolving door of players next to him. And when you don't have that consistency and cohesion with the player next to you, particularly on the offensive line, it's only going to make it more difficult for you to do your own job as well.
For sure. And I think for me, kind of the biggest concern I have with the 49ers offensive line is getting that consistency there, of course. And like you've been saying, Alex Mack sounds like he's going to add a certain level of consistency that the Niners just haven't had, especially last season. I mean, it was such a brutal issue last season. But I guess my only concern I have left for you with the offensive line is I know this is a great, if not a very good run blocking offensive line. They grade higher than anyone else in the league at it. But I think Trent Williams, when I was looking this up earlier, was the only starting offensive lineman that received a pass blocking grade over 62 from BFF last season. So you talked about Mike McGlinchey's struggles against D Ford, against guys who can set the edge and have that speed. What do you think about this team's ability to pass block? And do you think it's going to be as big of an issue as it was last season?
So first of all, no, I don't think it'll be as much of an issue. I think they've made great strides and they've made great additions to sort of fortify that offensive line. I think the biggest thing too is like I'm a fan of PFF and a lot of the numbers they have, but I think with offensive line play, you really have to rely on the eye test and understand the context of what goes into a given rep on the offensive line and what their assignments are, where the miscommunications might be and things like that. I think that's part of the reason why they invested the capital they did in Banks. Because if you go back and you watch his tape at Notre Dame, being a much larger guard, he was, I believe, 335 pounds. He's down probably to about 320, 315 now. But being that bigger guy, he rarely got beat on the interior by interior linemen in pass protection. And I think the 49ers got sick of having the center and right guard spots be so volatile and such a problematic, area of concern for them that they really went out and they solidified center, obviously, with Alex Mack. They were willing to spend that capital on Banks, hoping that kind of would eradicate any, particular weakness. And again, it doesn't mean that they're not going to get beat ever. Every lineman does eventually. But going back to even 2019, when they had that great year, they were 13-3. They're in the Super Bowl. Anybody who could stomach watching that Super Bowl, if you go back and watch, the offense really began to crumble when that interior really started to get beat over and over again. And, when there's a lot of things that went into that, but that's really what was the catalyst, in my opinion, for that, kind of collapse in the fourth quarter, was that right guard spot and that center spot could not hold blocks and pass protection. And it was an issue that I think kind of lingered into last season as well. So I think that it's much better now. Like, the offensive line looks much more improved. The other thing I would add is that the 49ers, again, their defensive line is so good that even their second team could be a first team for the majority of teams in the league. So it's kind of hard to gauge if it's just the offensive line is getting beat some days or if just the defensive line is that good. There's very few teams that I think the 49ers would face. I would say maybe Washington, Pittsburgh, and that probably honestly would be it in terms of teams that I think would match the level of depth and talent that the 49ers defensive line has. So I try to remind myself that as well. So I think that the pass protection itself will be much improved this year compared to recent years. Again, that right guard spot really is what it comes down to ultimately, because it's never been a great strength of Daniel Brunskill's, and we obviously are at an unknown with what Aaron Banks will be at this level. So that's one thing to keep an eye on, is whatever happens with that right guard spot. But as a whole, the unit should be much better.
Yeah, and that's great news, because I think, so often we get caught up in the individuals of the offensive line. People talk about Trent Williams so much, but in terms of units on a football team, I think that's the most important unit on any football team. And specifically, you touched on center. I mean, that's one of the most important positions on any Kyle Shanahan team, let alone just the offensive line. So I think it's great that they'll hopefully have a higher level of consistency with Alex Mack. And I think the hope is that, like you were saying, when they add these pieces and they won't have such a rotating door, it's going to make life easier for everybody else, including a guy like Mike McGlinchey, of course. So I think there's definitely high hopes for this offensive line in 2021. And I think there should be. I think that's fair for sure. The next topic I wanted to ask you about, and honestly, I might be getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but I kind of have a feeling where you might be going with this because it's been all over Twitter recently. It's been the guy people have been talking about a lot, but for you, who's been one of the most surprising players from 49ers training camp?
There's been two for me. One is Trent Sherfield, who I'm guessing that's who you're mentioning.
Absolutely.
He stood out to me the first day I was there, which was the second day of practice. On the far field, they were just doing individual drills, and he had a couple of really impressive catches. I think I tweeted out that day, the most impressive catch I saw all day was from Trent Sherfield. And then every day that I was out there, he looked really good. Again, my understanding was that they brought him in probably as a special teams guy, depth receiver, but he just, every day his stock continued to increase. He continued to look more comfortable running routes, particularly with Trey Lance, because he was getting a lot of work with that second team, with Sanu generally being the third wide receiver with the ones. So him and Trey Lance have developed a really nice connection between the two. He stepped up each day and looked like a guy who not only belongs on the roster, but belongs as a focal point of the offense, and is a guy who's going to provide, again, he has crisp route running ability, he has good hands, he has explosive speed after the catch. So he's been a joy to watch. And then the other player I would add is linebacker Jonas Griffith. He's a guy who has slowly crept up over the course. The first couple of days I watched him over the course of camp, he looked really good. He was a guy that I was talking to Brad, who's at DSF Niners, for anybody who's familiar with Brad Graham. I mentioned to him, I'm like, hey, like, this guy at 53, he can play, man. Like, we need to keep an eye on him. And every day during camp, he's done at least one or two little things that stand out that look really good. And then obviously with the injury to Azeez Al-Shaair, and then Demetrius Flanagan-Fowles has missed the last couple of days as well, he's had a chance to get a lot of first-team reps as well. And he hasn't been anything close to a liability. Generally, if you take a guy who's a depth guy who's running with the second and third team, you'd think that he might start to reveal why he's a second or third team level player. Griffith hasn't. He, infamously had the first interception of Trey Lance during training camp. He has really good sideline to sideline speed. He moves laterally really well. And he just looks like a guy who belongs with that grouping. So I think ultimately, Al-Shaair was out there as well today for anybody who didn't see that update. He had on shell, so he had on like the soft pads and shorts. He wasn't participating in practice, but he was rehabbing, which is a great sign because it was believed, I think, that he was going to miss about a month or so when he first got hurt. So he was out there. So whenever he comes back, I think he will, he being Al-Shaair, will have that third linebacking spot starting in base downs. Then I believe Flanagan-Fowles is right there in terms of the pecking order. But Griffith might be pushing Flanagan-Fowles, and I think Flanagan-Fowles is I don't say he's a project, but he's a guy that was converted safety to linebacker, and he has great speed and great instincts. But I also think that Griffith has been playing so well that as much as I like Flanagan-Fowles, I wouldn't be shocked at all if those two flipped on the depth chart. But I think Griffith has made the 49ers have a lot of self-reflecting during their roster projections and who they want to keep and not keep. And I think they're going to end up keeping a fifth linebacker in Griffith because he's played so well that I don't think you can risk leaving him on the practice squad again. He was a practice squad player last year. I wouldn't be shocked at all if the team ended up picking him up just because he's played that well during camp so far.
Wow, and that's great to hear in terms of the linebacker depth for this team, because I felt like it was a worry some had brought up over the offseason. But just like hearing from what you've been saying about Griffith and just Marcel Harris even converting, and then like you said, Flanagan-Fowles, it seems like they have enough depth at that position where if they were to have an injury or two, I mean, obviously can't lose a guy like Fred Warner, but they did lose Al-Shaair, so it's great to hear that within that linebacker room, they have that extra depth that they won't have to worry about picking up an extra guy like they are right now with safety, where they're kind of scrambling, bringing in Clinton Dix of the world and players like that to try and replace that second safety on the team. With Trent Sherfield too, I think the thing for me with him is that he just hasn't got a lot of opportunity in the league yet. I was looking up some of his stats on Football Reference earlier, under 50 targets, under 30 catches in 3 seasons with the Cardinals. And he was someone who, like you mentioned, got a lot of special teams reps with them, but had never truly gotten that opportunity as a receiver. And then, you mentioned his chemistry with Trey Lance. So I think that third wide receiver position has always been kind of a question for the 49ers this offseason. And, beyond Mohamed Sanu, Juwan Jennings, it kind of felt like, who was even going to emerge from that spot. So I'm glad to hear that they have another player who kind of like similar to Raheem Mostert is a special teamer who's able to really flourish in his role as a natural position player. So I'm really excited for the potential of Trent Sherfield. I guess my one question with him is, because I'm not there at camp, obviously, is he playing more outside or is he playing more of that slot role? Because I know
he's been doing both. He's been doing a little bit of both.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he's been going inside out. And the reason I asked that is because I think, people talk about that third wide receiver role. It's going to be that slot receiver, in my opinion. So between him, Mohamed Sanu, even a guy like Jauan Jennings, I think they're going to be battling it out. I guess before we move on to our next topic, what's your read between those three guys? Do you feel like anyone's edged themselves out yet, or do you still feel like that's kind of an open competition?
I mean, I'm sure it's an open competition. Nobody's, so much better than the other that things can't change. But Mohamed Sanu is definitely the front runner. He's a veteran. Kyle Shanahan is familiar with him. He's definitely displayed a little bit more of that veteran savvy when they're going up against zone coverage. He's definitely been a guy that's gotten to the soft spot in that zone and found ways to win over the middle consistently. And he definitely looks a lot better than he did last year when he was with the Niners for that short stint. He definitely is probably feeling better a year removed from that ankle, or more than a year, sorry, probably about 18 months now from that ankle injury he suffered way back when he was still in New England. So I project Sanu is going to get the first crack at that. But those two other guys in Sherfield and Jennings, I think will end up having significant roles. I think that Jennings has looked much better than I expected him to. He's a lot quicker than I expected. He's definitely a big guy that can win those contested balls as well. So I think that Jennings is actually going to take that role that they kind of envisioned for Jalen Hurd, where they're doing some of these end arounds, big slot guy who can win over the middle. While he's not the fastest guy, his run after the catch ability is a little underrated as well. So I think those three, and then Debo and Ayuk, are guys that I'm really confident and I believe are going to make the roster. It's that kind of, they've traditionally carried 6 wide receivers, so it's that last spot where things get really curious, and I'm not really sure. I don't think anybody's separated from the pack beyond those 5. Those 5 are clearly doing better, in my opinion, than everybody else. So it'll be really interesting to see who ends up taking that 6th spot. But those 5 all, not only do I think will make the team, but will have fairly significant roles that will be carved out for them during the season coming up right now.
Yeah, and Jennings was a guy I was personally a huge fan of. Watching his stuff back at Tennessee, he was just using so many type of different ways. So hearing you, say he could have that potential Jalen Hurd role, that sticks out to me. I think seeing his ability in the red zone, just in possession catches, like you just talked about. I'm really excited for Jauan Jennings. He was always someone who was high on my list, so I'm glad to hear that he's probably going to make the team, and that you certainly feel like he's established himself as one of the 5 best receivers on the roster right now. The next thing I did want to talk about, and this isn't as much camp related, we're kind of going to go to more of a macro perspective here for the next 2 topics. Then we'll come back around with some Trey Lance stuff at the end. This is something I've been curious about. And this, I'm new to covering the 49ers. I'm newer to covering the NFL in specific. But looking at how the 49ers build their team, build their roster, the thing I've noticed the most is that they don't seem to value the corner position maybe as much as some other teams in the NFL do now. If you look, Richard Sherman was pretty much the biggest investment they made. I think Kayla Witherspoon was the 66th overall pick back in 2017. So do you feel like the 49ers value the corner as much as they should? And if they don't, why do they do that? And what is it about their roster construction that leads them away from that?
So I actually don't think that they devalue corners the way that narrative, respectfully, I just disagree personally. Like that Richard Sherman signing was pretty significant at the time. Kayla Williams, while it was, not a huge, average annual value deal, they did go out and get Kayla Williams. That was one of the first signings they made when Kyle and John came over and took over. I think that they have just taken more of an approach of not wanting to overpay or I don't say overdraft, but, they prioritize other positions there. And I don't think that it's necessarily on purpose all the time, but I do think that they felt that if they had to choose between having a really beefed up defensive line or allocating some of those resources to the corners, they're more in line that a better defensive line is going to make the secondary better, where some people feel the opposite. They feel good coverage is going to make the defensive line better. So I think it is just a philosophical thing. I don't think that they value corners any less. I just think that they value defensive linemen more, and you can only allocate so many resources to so many positions. But again, like the signings of, bringing guys in like Verrett on low risk deals like that, bringing in a Kayla Williams in free agency, re-signing Emmanuel Mosley. They spent fairly significant capital on Kayla Witherspoon when they drafted him. I just think that it's a situation where they feel comfortable with what they have. And I think especially when they had Richard Sherman, they felt good thinking that, Richard Sherman would be capable of locking down half of a field during a given game. And now obviously with Jason Verrett, and he's looked the part during training camp, they feel they have a bona fide number one corner. So I think it's more so they're just content addressing that first corner position and then addressing slot corner, which is becoming a starting position in the NFL now with how often teams are running out of nickel and dime packages. So I think that they're more so just, it's a situation where they aren't ignoring the position or devaluing it. They're just not, hell-bent on creating the kind of depth. Like the amount of depth they have on the defensive line is clearly far more prioritized than the depth they've allocated to the corner spot. So I think it's more so, again, just a depth thing where they might not value that corner two spot the same way they'd value a rotational pass rusher.
Yeah, and I totally hear that, and I think, like you said, it's really a philosophical thing more than anything. I mean, just looking at the first round picks, we know how much they value defensive linemen, even the interior defensive linemen, maybe more than some other teams are willing to. So I hear you on that, and in terms of the depth thing. I think that's a huge part of that too, is that with defensive linemen, if you do want a great defensive line, having four great pass rushers is awesome, right? Having four great starting defensive linemen is great, but over the course of a season, you really need 7, 8 guys to have that sort of depth where you can have defensive linemen in waves rather than just relying on those 4 players consistently over and over. So I definitely hear you on that. And I guess my whole thing with the corner position is just that in the last few years, I would have rather they've taken a bigger risk at the position, maybe. But like you were saying, they're very content with Jason Verrett being that number one corner. They're confident in him. I mean, Grant, multiple people have reported this offseason. Jason Verrett looks as awesome as he's ever looked. He looks as healthy as he's ever looked. So it's not a question of that for me. It's more a question of that depth, like you were saying, that next corner after Jason Verrett. And I was along the lines of, and this is a little revisionist history, but I would have rather they've maybe gone after an Asante Samuel rather than Aaron Banks. But like you said, the way they've been going after the corner position, it's not like they completely devalue the position. They're just not taking the big swings and the big risks that maybe some other NFL teams have been taking in the last few seasons.
Yeah, and that's just basically what it comes down to. Is it's just they've allocated resources elsewhere. I really wanted Trayvon Marrig. He was a safety out of TCU. He also had a kind of similar playing style to Jimmy Ward, where he could have played in the slot, he could have played man coverage, he could have matched up with the receivers. And I'm not gonna lie, I was a little frustrated. They traded out of that spot with the Raiders, and the Raiders took them with the pick the Niners traded out of. So I understand the frustration. It would have been nice to see them add some DB depth there, but also, at the same time, like Tavon Wilson's looked really good. I still think Jaquiski Tartt is a great player. So I don't think that they're just like neglecting it totally, and they are like, inept at assembling a good secondary. I just think, again, that they've found success really beefing up that D line. They obviously know that Fred Warner is phenomenal in coverage, especially over the middle of the field. So they paid him. They have him locked down over the middle. So I think it's just a situation where they feel the scheme and the talent of the collective 11 on the field will kind of make up for any gap there might be. And, to his credit, Emmanuel Mosley's looked great since he came back the last few days in practice. So I don't think that corner 2 spot is much of a concern. It's more so if one of those starting corners gets hurt and the guy who's going to have to come in, that's where things get a little bit dicey.
Yeah, and I think that's been the main concern of 49ers fans over the offseason with the secondary in specific is if either one of those two guys get hurt. I don't want to say it's necessarily season over, but I think it certainly lowers the ceiling of this football team if you were to lose one of those players for the season. And like you were just saying, and like I said, it's a philosophical thing. You have to pick and choose with how you team build. And with the 49ers, they value that defensive line depth more than they would value having more corners, let's say like a Baltimore Ravens or Miami Dolphins or one of those type of teams. And I'm glad that they stick to their philosophy. and that they are consistent with it. And like you mentioned, they have taken some risks. Jason Verrett certainly is one of those. So I'm interested to see how the position goes over the next few seasons specifically, because they don't have many guys signed beyond this season, even beyond the year after that. So I'm really interested to see how they attack it in the future specifically. But I do want to go to two of my favorite players on the 49ers next before we touch on Trey Lance, because for everyone watching, I know we haven't talked a ton of Trey Lance. We'll end on Trey Lance. I want to make you guys wait for that. We got to do this show the right way. But I want to talk about two of my favorite players on the 49ers, Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel. For you, who do you think is going to make that jump in 2021 specifically? Who do you think is going to have the biggest improvement out of those two players this season?
I mean, it's kind of open to interpretation. I just think those guys do two different things totally differently. I think Brandon Ayuk is more close to a complete alpha X wide receiver, and Deebo's going to be more of that Z wide receiver, particularly in this offense where he's going to get a lot of run after the catch ability, a lot of looks over the middle. So, it's tough too because Ayuk had a really good rookie year, and we know Deebo obviously had a fantastic rookie year. Last year was a little bit hampered due to injuries, but when he did play, the offense looked totally different. I guess, I don't know who would make the biggest jump, but I would say that Ayuk will end up having the better, I don't say better statistical season. I think Ayuk's going to have obviously a much higher yards per reception. He's going to be more of a downfield threat, a guy that you're working 15, 20 yards downfield. And I think Deebo is more than capable of doing that, but we've also seen how much of a weapon he is as an extension of the run game, how good he is running those shallow drag routes. He's the king of running drift routes, which is a staple in the Shanahan offense, work in the middle of the field. So I think those guys' skill sets play so well off one another that I'm not really, inclined to say one's going to be better than the other just because they do two totally different things in my eyes. But I think Brandon Ayuk will be the guy that sort of solidifies himself as, a dominant player. I don't know, everybody who is, I assume most people are familiar with Brett Coleman. Brett Coleman does a lot of great work with film study and stuff. He said that by the end of this season, I think it was like 2 days ago, he said by the end of the season, people are going to be talking about Brandon Ayuk the way we're talking about Devontae Adams. I love Brandon Ayuk, but I pumped the brakes on that a little bit because I think Devontae Adams is the best wide receiver in football. But I think that it's very encouraging that these, people who aren't as, plugged into the Niners as you and I may be, where we're just, hyper focused on this team and what's going on with it, are looking from the outside in and seeing how special of a talent Brandon Ayuk is. And that's one thing. It's been a treat watching him in camp. As good as Deebo is, a lot of his really elite traits haven't been able to be on display because these guys aren't really hitting and tackling the way they would during a game. And part of what makes Deebo so good is his ability to break through tackles and be kind of a physical, I always call him like a battering ram where he's just wearing defenses down over and over again. But Ayuk has been able to be out there displaying that catch radius, that speed, his ability to get open. So I would be very excited for both. I think that the 49ers are going to have a very strong receiving unit. And that's part of the reason why those two and the skill they possess is why I never really got caught up in the hype of them, needing to make this massive upgrade at the third wide receiver spot this offseason. And I still feel that way. But again, like if I had to pick one guy to really take that, monumental leap to where he's in that sort of borderline elite discussion, I think it's definitely going to be Brandon Ayuk. And that takes nothing away from Deebo Samuel. It's just the skill set that I think each has. Ayuk is more tailored to be that kind of alpha X wide receiver that we talk about among the league's elite.
For sure. And I definitely hear you on that. And oh gosh, man, you're making me kind of reconsider what I wanted to say here, because the way I kind of wanted to go about this specifically was that I'm a huge Brandon Ayuk fan. I'm probably the leader of the fan club. In fact, I'm gonna have a jersey coming in the way soon. I love Brandon Ayuk, but I feel like in that rookie season, he displayed so much already with his fluidity, his wingspan, his catchability, just how great he can be as that dominant, like X type receiver, like you're talking about, that really true number one sort of classic wide receiver in the NFL right now that I certainly believe he can become. But the reason I wanted to go with Deebo Samuel with this one specifically was because I think we've seen a lot from Deebo Samuel in terms of like you mentioned, that weapon sort of role, that ability to just batter people in the middle of the field and when he has the ball in space. But the thing I'm most excited for, and the reason I went about it this way, was because I think Deebo Samuel, I'm hoping, is going to get more deep catches. I'm hoping that they're going to be targeting him more down the field more. And that's something that we just didn't really see from him in his rookie season almost at all. I think I was looking this up earlier. Of his 77 targets in that rookie season, 6 of them were considered deep targets. And then last year, I think he only had 1 or 0. So this is a guy who the 49ers just haven't targeted deep down the field almost at all. So in that aspect, that's kind of what I wanted to that's where I wanted to go with this, because it seems like, there were some worries about how Brandon or Deebo Samuel would return from his injury, how he would respond this season. But from all the reports we've seen in training camp, he looks better than ever. His body looks better than ever. And he's getting more of those downfield catches that we just didn't see him have in his first couple of seasons.
Yeah, that's totally a fair assessment. I think that's a good point.
For sure. And I want to end on Trey Lance. Like I said, I do have a lot to talk about with Trey Lance. And the first thing I wanted to ask you about, because you've been there, you've been seeing Trey Lance in person. In the preseason, he's going to get, I believe he's going to play about a quarter and a half in this first upcoming game. At least that's the way I see it. You can correct me if you think I'm wrong. But what do you think he can do to separate himself over the course of the preseason for the 49ers to the point where they are going to make him that no doubt number 1 starting quarterback?
So today was a really good glimpse into why he may not be ready. Objectively, I have no agenda. I have no, side that I'm taking between him and Garoppolo. I think that objectively, anybody looking at it would agree that Trey Lance is the far more talented quarterback. He's bigger, he's faster, he has a better arm. He's able to put balls into windows that Jimmy just can't. But he also still is a rookie learning the nuance of some of these things. And part of the thing with Trey Lance that must be considered is that he was playing on a team, I don't really, the FCS competition stuff doesn't really, I don't put much stock into it. But I do put stock into the fact that he was playing on a team that was significantly better than the majority of teams they played against. And as a result, they weren't trailing very often, and they weren't in positions where they had to come from behind, play from behind. And I think today was a great glimpse into why it may be a little premature to crown him as that starter, because during situational drills, they had 2 chances where it was 4th down. I think it was like 4th and goal from the 8. They were down 4 points. They needed a touchdown. One of the plays, Lance scrambled for so long in the pocket that the clock ran out, so he didn't even get a playoff. If it was a real game, the clock would have hit 0 without the ball ever leaving his hands. And then on another one, I believe the clock ultimately was running after they got to the line and got set, and I don't think they ever got the playoff. So stuff like that with clock management. And then I noticed too, even though it was wild, during the 2-minute drills, he had this play where after the 2-minute warning, they start at the 2-minute 30 mark. So they run a play, it gets to the 2-minute warning, and then it becomes a 2-minute drill. The first play after the 2-minute drill, they handed the ball off, and there was not very much of a sense of urgency. They huddled, which I thought was really strange. So again, this might be something that Shanahan and the offensive staff are doing on purpose. But I was literally jotting down in my notes, no sense of urgency during the 2-minute drill. There doesn't seem to be any kind of real, understanding and awareness of the clock and how they need to get going. And again, it's the second team, so there might be issues beyond just Trey Lance. But he followed that play up. That was when he threw that deep 35-yard pass to Trent Sherfield that I'm sure many people have heard of by now, which was probably the best throw of the day. So it's just little things like that, like clock management. There's still some timing things he needs to work out, which it'll happen over time as he gets more reps with these receivers and runs with this offense. And he has a propensity to miss guys high. He misses a lot of throws high. There's some throws that he's sailing on guys in the flat, where it might just be, he's still a little anxious and adjusting to this level, and he's kind of, letting the ball sail on him a little bit. But again, it's not like he's out here, throwing a bunch of picks and being indecisive in the pocket. Like, he is a tremendously gifted player, and any 49ers fan should be extremely excited about what the possibilities are with this man quarterbacking the team for the next decade plus, or whatever their, long-term outlook may be. I just think that he has a few things that he needs to work through. So he needs to clean up the clock management issues. He needs to clean up throwing those balls high. He needs to improve the timing a little bit. And I think that he needs to translate those things not only in practice, but also into some game action during the preseason. So if he has a strong showing, the first game, it'll probably be an adjustment. The last game, traditionally it's the 4th game. Obviously they're switching to 3 this year. There's not much weight put into it. But if he has a strong showing during that second preseason game, which is kind of known as the dress rehearsal, I think he still has a shot to take that starting job. I just think that there's so many little things right now that get lost behind the scenes because there are, I'm guilty of it too. I'm out there saying, "Hey, wow, what a throw by Trey Lance." I'm on Twitter putting that stuff out there too. But I think people get caught up in seeing so much of the positives about him that the negative stuff gets swept under the rug a little bit. And again, as great as of a player as he is, there are still minor things he needs to work through. And until he cleans up little things like clock management and some accuracy issues and timing and stuff like that, I don't think Kyle Shanahan will just thrust him into that starting role, even if all that big playability is there, that arm, the rushing ability, and all the great things you can do. There still are little minor things that haven't really been discussed too much that he needs to work on.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. I've been trying to read more about the negatives of Trey Lance because it has been so overtly positive with him that it feels like he's just not failing at all. But like you've been saying, those details, ironing out what's going on in the offense, being able to orchestrate things. It's still something that I'm sure is an adjustment for him at the NFL level. And to me, the main thing with Trey Lance is we know his ability as an athlete. We know how he can expand Kyle Shanahan's offense. I don't think there's any question of the way that he can really bring the 49ers offense from the level they are now to an even higher level. But there is that question of you are a rookie. You did only start one season. You haven't played a ton of football. How well are you going to adjust to in-game when everything's firing at you, making those little decisions, being great with those details, like you just mentioned, not letting the clock run out, that things like that, where your veteran quarterbacks who have so much experience are like Jimmy Garoppolo, for example, are just more on top of that sort of stuff. And it does take some time. And I guess, in terms of the negatives of Trey Lance, the one kind of other question I have with him, and maybe this isn't a negative, but it is something that I think could be different from Jimmy Garoppolo, is how do you feel like he's going through his progressions? Do you feel like he's done a good job going through the progressions of the play as they happen?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one thing that stands out. So again, he's a guy that is big and fast and has all the physical gifts, but that's one thing that stood out. And if I go back through my notes, back towards the beginning of camp when it was still just shorts and, jerseys, no pads, and progressing into the first couple days of pads, there were consistent plays where he was hitting deep balls down the field, but it was clearly a second, third read, working through his progressions, not sticking on a read too long, not waiting too long to move off of a read. And that's where, again, you hear Kyle Shanahan and the coaching staff rave about how much they value his intelligence and his IQ. And I don't think that that's just, fluff. I think that played a very large part in why they ultimately selected him, because as much as the physical gifts are exciting, we've seen plenty of quarterbacks come in with rocket arms or blazing speed who end up fizzling out of the league because they don't have it between the ears. I think Trey Lance is a guy who certainly does. And it's not just that he has the innate IQ. It's the fact that he has the drive and the work ethic to want to get better and better. And, Shanahan said multiple times he was shocked at how hard he worked and the jump he took from OTAs to the beginning of training camp. And I think that bodes very well for moving forward. But yeah, it's not a situation where it's like, oh man, this guy has a lot of talent. He just sticks on a read too long, or he, stares down his primary receiver. He's great. And he's also great in the pocket. I was going to say he's great at working his progressions, but he has a great feel in the pocket. He has good footwork in the pocket. He had a great throw the other day where he sidestepped the rush and threw a dart like 30 yards down the right sideline to Dwelly. And it hit him in stride, good ball placement. So again, I think Lance is a guy. They know he's 21. They know that he's still a young quarterback who, obviously had only one game to play last year. And even when he was playing in 2019, it's at the FCS level. All these things, like that's why I think they really mean what they say when they're talking about not rushing him and wanting to keep Garoppolo on the roster just in case. So again, like I have almost nothing but good things to say about Trey Lance. He's been a joy to watch. The way the ball jumps out of this guy's hand is crazy. The velocity he puts on some of these throws just with no effort whatsoever, it seems like, is incredible. And I think that will translate very well. I just think we need to remind ourselves, and I'm reminding myself daily that he still is a rookie quarterback that's going to need a little bit of seasoning. So if he does struggle a little bit, even when he does eventually come in, if he has a little bit of those issues, I'm not comparing him to the guy, but, if you go back and you read reports out of the first year Patrick Mahomes was in Chiefs training camp, he was throwing picks left and right. There's players on record saying that they were concerned that they wasted picks trading up to get him because they're like, what's going on with this guy? And we obviously know ever since he ended up, claiming that starting role, he's been one of the best quarterbacks in the entire league, if not the best quarterback in the entire league. So again, I'm not comparing Trey Lance and saying he's going to have a similar trajectory. I'm just saying that there are growing pains these guys go through, no matter how talented they may be physically, and no matter how hard they're willing to work and how gifted they may be mentally.
For sure. And something I always love to mention to people is I'm at FSU currently. I'm about to enter my senior year there. I'm older than Trey Lance by 6 months. He is a very young kid and he just needs some time to mature. And I think that's super fair in terms of the evaluation of him. And going off what you were just saying, this kind of does lead me to the last topic. And I want to make sure I approach this the right way, because I agree with a lot of what you're saying just now, and I think they can't rush Trey Lance in any way. And in my opinion, in terms of the quarterback battle, it's not about Jimmy Garoppolo at all. It's always been about Trey Lance and when he's quote unquote ready in Kyle Shanahan's eyes. But my angle on this topic in terms of can the 49ers afford to sit on Trey Lance for too long is in terms of the cap, in terms of the evaluation of the 49ers money moving forward, there is a huge risk in going into the season with having Jimmy Garoppolo on the roster with the out that they have in his contract. And when I take everything into consideration, if they can trade Jimmy Garoppolo at some point midseason, and let's say Trey Lance inserts himself as the starter at some point, whether that's around the bye week, a little bit before, a little bit after, that's kind of the area I'm looking at. But I guess my main concern in terms of the 49ers waiting too long on Trey Lance is that with Trey Lance, in terms of maximizing that rookie contract, maximizing your Super Bowl window with him, those first 4 years of that rookie contract are the most important years. Pretty much years 2 through 4 are those key seasons when, if you look at the recent history of rookie quarterback contracts and the way teams have been able to take full advantage of that, that's when teams have succeeded the most. So I guess my question to you is, do you think it would be crazy for the 49ers to insert Trey Lance as the starter week 1 with the idea that they can cut Jimmy Garoppolo, trade him, and then potentially roll over that cap space to 2022 when the salary cap is going to be exploding more than it ever has in 10 years. I've been reading all this data, how in the past 11 years since the most recent collective bargaining agreement, the average increase on the salary cap is $11 million. This upcoming year, it's going to jump from 185 to a minimum of 208. So my question is, if the 49ers want to go full in on Trey Lance, if they want to push all the chips to the table with him, is it too much of a risk to just completely cut bait from Jimmy Garoppolo and then go into that free agency saying to themselves, we're not just going to re-sign all of the players we want to re-sign, we're going to build the best roster in the NFL around Trey Lance? Because I think they could win the Super Bowl that way. I think they could maximize Trey that way, but there's so much risk associated with a potential move like that.
Yeah, so I like actually having this discussion because I think that there ends up being this misconception with cap space. So the most valuable thing you can ever have cap space for is to re-sign your own players. And this is my thinking behind it. So in different sports, like the NBA, if you're clearing cap space, you're clearing, spots on your roster or whatever. I think that there's a path to signing legitimate superstars. Like there's a path to adding extreme difference makers with that cap space that you cleared. In the NFL, for the most part, like there's rare exceptions, but 95% of the time, I'd say there aren't difference makers that are worth risking, risking a season the way you would if Trey Lance were to get hurt and you didn't have a backup option like Garoppolo on the roster anymore. If you did decide to go that way, generally the players that hit free agency are guys that are good enough that they're not going to come back to their team on a reasonable team-friendly deal, but also not so good that the team is doing whatever they can to not let them out of the building, if that makes sense. So generally what ends up happening in free agency is you get a lot of players who are around the league average level who start to get paid above league average money, which is why you see successful organizations like New England. And it's ironic because this year they spent more than anybody in free agency, but for their 2-decade-long run, they didn't do that. They let guys walk. They kept the
that was an anomaly for Bill Belichick. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And I think it was more so just because they didn't really have any other choice, and they're trying to maximize the fact that they know Belichick is probably on his way out. Not fair. I don't want to, act like I have any insider information just based on the fact that he's up there in age. He's been doing this a long time. But so that's my whole thing is building a team through free agency has never really been a winning formula. Drafting and re-signing your own guys has been, and Parag and that front office has proven to be very creative with how they're able to do that. So I don't think I've had that discussion with a lot of people, and I understand the logic behind it on the surface. But I try to remind people there's nobody out there. Like, think about this past year in free agency. There's nobody out there that really was such a difference maker and such a star-studded elite level player that would make this roster, put them over the top, that I'd be willing to risk having the season that they're going to have currently go by the wayside because their starter gets hurt and they don't have a viable backup option. Admittedly, I was a guy that was for them cutting or trading Jimmy before free agency began, simply because I didn't think they'd be able to resign the amount of players that they did and extend Trent Williams if they kept Jimmy. And hey, guess what? They did. They brought back Juszczyk. They brought back K1. They brought back Jaquiski Tart. They obviously extended Trent Williams. They extended Fred Warner. So I think that the fact that they were able to do that and keep Jimmy means they clearly have something mapped out and they're able to maneuver that cap in ways that very few teams are. So I would much rather have Jimmy Garoppolo on the roster, even if you do start Trey Lance. And again, as much as I think that Jimmy is a competitor and he wants that starting job, I'm just speculating here. I don't think he's going to have any problems holding that backup spot while he's making $26 million this year. So I think you end up in a situation where should something happen to Trey Lance, which we saw last year, injuries completely derailed their season. It happens. The 49ers are in a spot where they're much more confident that they can still compete. And again, I objectively and subjectively feel like, I think objectively we all see it, and subjectively I can confirm my own opinion is Trey Lance is more talented. But Jimmy Garoppolo he's looked really good. He's spun the ball really well, and he's looked great as camp has gone on. And I think that Jimmy still gives them a chance to win and gives them the chance to – he's not going to carry the team. I don't think he's ever been that player. I don't think he will be that player where he's going to week in, week out, put up these massive performances where he's, single-handedly kind of keeping them in games and putting them over the top. But I think he's a more than capable NFL starter who can be an average, 15 to 20, if we're ranking quarterbacks in the league. And given the depth of the roster, they can win that way. They almost won a Super Bowl with that Jimmy in 2019. And I think that the roster as a whole is deeper this year than it was in 2019. So keeping him on the roster is infinitely more valuable, in my opinion, than cutting him for some cap space next year to sign some average players in free agency. And that's kind of like the summary of my thoughts on that.
Well, and that's great. I'm glad you talked about it that way in specific, because I think, listen, I'm a huge cap guy. I love paying attention to team spending, team building in specific. But like you mentioned, you can have all the cap space in the world, but you have to be able to use it the right way. And if there's not going to be those type of players available who are going to be difference makers on the 49ers next season, having all that cap space, it kind of becomes a null point, right? It doesn't take your team from one level to the next. If anything, it just solidifies the depth that they would have. So I definitely hear you on that. And I was a huge proponent of this plan simply in the idea that the 49ers could build that type of roster around Trey Lance. But like you've been mentioning, I just don't know how realistic that is. And then when you take into consideration how much draft capital they just spent on Trey Lance, it's not like they should be going out and trading second, third round picks right now for potential starters like Stephon Gilmore's of the world or JC Jackson, right? Players who 49ers fans have been clamoring for a little bit. The 49ers aren't in a position to make that type of move, that type of trade, not just this year, but over the next 2-3 seasons, unless something drastic were to happen. They were make some type of trade, for one of their blue chip players, and they were able to bring in draft capital. But the way the roster is constructed now, the way the 49ers have gone about everything, I definitely hear you. And you've definitely swayed me a lot, because in my mind, I had this idea that the 49ers could just, reload their roster, build a much, much better roster than they had in 2019. But like you've been saying, that cap space is theoretically great. But in terms of applying that in real life and actually being able to elevate your team, I definitely hear you on that. I'm not 100% sure that the 49ers could do that.
Yeah, and you have to live in the now. If they were a team that was up and coming, where it looked like they were going to have a promising future, but they also still were building towards something, I totally get it. This team is loaded. They have, I was going to say great players. They have elite players all over the place. they're a team that looks like they are going to be contending for a division title, home field in the playoffs, and hopefully a Super Bowl. That's how good this team is. You have to live in the present, and you have to maximize this roster any way you can. And it's great to build for the long term, which I think they did by moving the capital they did, getting a talent like Trey Lance in the building, but you don't cut ties. If they were able to get like Andy Dalton, for example, I would have been okay with them moving off of Jimmy. I don't think that Jimmy is, a guy that's so much more talented on the field than Andy Dalton that I would have a trouble replacing one with the other. But at the same time, too, the teammates, if you ask anybody around the team, like they love Jimmy Garoppolo. Like his teammates really like the guy. And as somebody who's been a critic of his for a while, and I've had issues with the way he plays, I still respect the fact that he has the respect and the admiration of his teammates. So I think that goes a long way, too. It's much better for him to organically lose his job to a more talented player than it would be to have just cut ties with him and have another veteran come in. I think that dynamic does matter, because as much as it is about what's on the field, and these guys are getting paid a lot of money, you expect them to come to work and work hard regardless of who the quarterback is. There is a human element to this as well. And I think the fact they're able to retain Jimmy while also bringing in the young guy in Lance to possibly supplant him this season ended up working out way better than it would have just cutting him and replacing him with another guy. Even though me sitting here as an objective like outsider, just looking at things from an objective team building standpoint, it may have made sense, but we do have to factor in that human element. So I think that it played out the best way it possibly could have.
Yeah, and I definitely hear you on the Andy Dalton point. If there was any other way they could have gone about this scenario, I may have preferred that. But even in what you're saying, for Trey Lance to get the full buy-in, not just from the franchise, but from the players that he's going to be playing with the coaching staff, he has to win the job organically from Jimmy Garoppolo, like you've been saying. It can't be a sort of thing where the reins are just handed over to the kid. I just don't think you can operate that way in the NFL. So yeah, I definitely hear you on that point, because I think from like what you just said, from a salary cap standpoint, from just logically looking objectively from a team building perspective, it on the outside looking in, it would have made more sense to maybe go that sort of route, maybe cut ties from Jimmy Garoppolo. But when you take into account the human element and how these players feel about how big of a contenders they are, I think you kind of have no choice but to let Jimmy Garoppolo lose the job eventually to Trey Lance. And yeah, it might harm your salary cap in the present slightly, but like you mentioned, the 49ers have so many elite players across this team at so many different levels. I don't know how many difference makers they could add right now who could start over their current players that they have at the moment. And I'm glad we covered this topic, because this to me was the topic that I've been kind of the most passionate about over the offseason. I feel like I've been banging my head on the wall almost, but hearing your perspective, it's definitely something I haven't heard before. And I think it's something 49ers fans have to take into account, that human element of what goes into all of this, that you can't just do things on paper, right? You have to let things play out on the field, on the practice field, in the organization. And I think the 49ers are going about this the right way. I think they've made all the right decisions in the present. So Jordan / cousin, I appreciate your time, man. If anybody has not checked your stuff out before, which, man, I don't know why you're here. If you haven't, check out all this stuff in the description below. I got his Twitter linked. I got all of his articles from Niners Nation. Make sure you're reading everything he's been putting out. You've been putting out some awesome content from every single day of training camp. So I look forward to reading that every single day. And I would really recommend that to anyone else who's a big 49ers fan who wants to learn more about this team. We're going to get out of here, Jordan. Just before we do, is there anything you want to plug, anything you want to talk about that you have coming up in the future?
No. So, just like you said, you can follow me. I do all my work for Niners Nation, so I'll be posting my articles there. I've been doing training camp notes every day. I do rattle off a good amount of tweets every day, even if it's not a day of practice, just my thoughts regarding the team. I also wanted to give a quick shout out to my guy, Brad Graham at the SF Niners. He's doing great work as well, covering camp. And then next week, I will be out in LA for the joint practices with the Chargers. And I imagine most people on this channel are familiar with Jason Aponte. Jason Aponte will be out there with me as well. So if you're not familiar with him, definitely give his YouTube, check it out, give it a like, subscribe, whatever. He's doing great work as well. So those two guys have been riding with me through this whole camp coverage stuff too. So I just wanted to give them their kudos as well, because they've been doing phenomenal work as well. And yeah, just, like I said, just Niners Nation, my Twitter is where the majority of my work goes. And thanks for having me on, Ben. This has been a really fun time.
Yeah, I'm glad I got to talk to you, Jordan. This was such a fun time doing this. For everybody, I'll be back streaming tomorrow. That's going to be my last stream for a little bit, and then I'll be back. I'll be there with Rich Madrid tomorrow, so get excited for that. I'm sure I'll have a lot to talk about with him. Jordan, I appreciate your time so much. I'm sure we should find some other time to do this again before the start of the season. But make sure you check out all of Jordan's stuff, like I said, if you haven't already. And I'll be back tomorrow, guys. I'll see you then. Have a great Tuesday night.